Are we live now? Okay, great. Hello, welcome everybody. This is CS280 Computer Vision. I'm Jitendra Malik, and this class will be co-taught by me, Stella Yu, who's here, and Alyosha Efros, and we also have two TAs who are going to show up later and be introduced to you. As you can guess from the state of the room, we are overflowing. The capacity of this room is 96 or 100 or something like that, and there are many more people who want to be enrolled in this class. So what we are going to do is we are going to have webcasting. The class is being videotaped and it will be available on YouTube in some time. So those of you who don't like the experience of sitting in the corridors and such, if you want to go home and wait for a few hours, you can watch the lectures online. Of course, I do welcome people who are in class, and I really do hope that some of you will be in class, because I can't lecture to an empty room. Okay, so this is computer vision, and the purpose of this class is to tell you lots of stuff about it and take you from the basics to the most advanced material. And today's lecture, what we are going to do is to do a whirlwind tour of where this field is today, and that's what the purpose of this lecture is. In terms of nitty-gritty details, those are going to be there in the syllabus. There is a Piazza forum and all that in the usual way. I don't want to spend too much time talking about that. I want to spend 1 minute talking about the prerequisites for this course. It is assumed that you have some background in machine learning, and specifically you know about neural networks and you can train them using backpropagation. If you don't have that background, you should drop this class and take some other class, and there are several classes at Berkeley which can help you get that background. For example, CS189 is a standard undergrad class, as well as there are deep learning classes taught by Professor John Canny and others. So those are the classes you should take if you don't have background in basic neural network training, such as backpropagation. If the word backpropagation doesn't make sense to you, this class will not make sense to you. We are going to assume that you already have that background. Okay? I don't mind if you, in fact, get up and leave right now if you don't have that background. If you have that background, then you're ready for this class. There is some general knowledge that you need of linear algebra and calculus, but by the time you're a senior, or if you are a grad student in any engineering or science discipline, you typically have that background. So that's good. Okay, so now let's get into the fun stuff of what computer vision is about. And let me start with this argument that Hans Moravec made, and this is a book back in the mid to late 90s, and he was playing an interesting game, and the game was to try to estimate the computing power of the human brain and compare it with the computers of the day. So he makes some assumption about what's the clock rate at which neurons operate, and how many bits are stored at every synapse, and so on. And you can debate some of these things, but he comes up with some numbers of 10 to the 14 instructions per second on the human brain, and about that many bytes of storage. And so then he produced this plot, and this plot was on the x-axis is time. So this curve goes up to like mid 1990s, because that's when he wrote this book, 2000, and we are now pretty close to 2020. And there are various computers and their computing power. Where on the y-axis is instructions per second, or millions of instructions per second. And then this other axis has what's the computing power of various brains, of the brain of a spider or a lizard or a mouse or a monkey or a human. And assuming extrapolation using Moore's law, you get something like in 2025 you would have the computing power of the human brain. Or of course, if you use 100 nodes together, then you have that in 2015. So he made this prediction back in 1995. So the bottom line is, we are now in an era where you do have, by some estimates, the computing power of the human brain. This was not true for the vast history of AI. I started in AI in the early 80s, and at that time the kind of computing power we had was much, much smaller, right? And at that time what people could do was limited by that. At this point, that's not the limitation. The limitation is our ideas, our creativity, our ability to model these phenomena, and so on and so forth. So when you when you read about the major successes of AI in the recent past, keep in mind that part of it has been enabled by the advances in computing. Next point that I want to make is that this course is about computer vision, but computer vision does not exist in isolation. Vision is connected to motor control and language and semantic reasoning. And I've drawn these 3 nodes, and then each of them I have these bidirectional edges to indicate that all of these are connected to every other capability. And how do we see that? One way of seeing that is to think about intelligence as it arose. Intelligence is a very biological thing. We are now seeking to replicate it in silicon, but the existence proof of intelligence is in biology. And it's good to think about what people would call the phylogeny of intelligence, the evolutionary history of intelligence. So something like 550 million years ago, the so-called Cambrian era, we have the first multicellular animals. And these multicellular animals start to move and they perceive their environment. So that's where what you could say is the beginnings of vision and locomotion. And plants don't do that, right? Plants don't move. And this ability to move and the ability to see, they sort of went hand in hand. Because if you can see, then you can locate food at a distance. And you can go back to food which you knew about in previous times. And that's a major asset, right? It considerably increases the scope of your where you can gather food from. And then the other abilities build on these abilities. So some animals become predators. They don't eat just plants, they eat other animals. Then of course animals can find each other, so sex and mating becomes possible. So there is an argument that the so-called Cambrian explosion, the rapid flowering in the number of species was in fact triggered by this joint evolution of vision or perception more broadly and locomotion. And so let's keep this in mind even today, that vision is for a purpose, and one of those important purposes is locomotion, certainly, and manipulation is another. There are examples in the animal kingdom which are of these species which have this funny life cycle, where part of their life cycle they are like animals moving about, and then part of their life cycle they are like plants, stationary at some place. And this is the sea squirt, and I actually have a link to this. And when this animal gets to that stage of its life cycle, when it is stationary, it actually digests its visual system and its brain, because it has no use for it anymore. What value does a vision system have for an organism which does not move? So imagine these tall redwood trees in a beautiful forest, and if they had a vision system, what would it benefit them, right? The brain uses up energy. I mean, for the human brain, something like 30% of our metabolic cost is in the brain. So it has to give you some value, right? Because that means that much more food has to be collected. If it gives you no value, then you will get rid of it, and this animal eats up its own brain. Okay, so let's moving along in this evolutionary story to the last 5-10 million years, which is the development of the hominid line, the line from which humans emerged. And a key step there is what's called bipedalism, the ability to walk on 2 feet, because now your hands are free. And once your hands are free, you can you can build tools, and then you can manipulate the environment in great ways, right? Stone tools to begin with, but computers now. I mean, these are all tools built by humans because they had their hands free. And interestingly, the development of the brain in these various hominid species and the development of the opposable thumb and various aspects of sort of tool building, they go hand in hand. It was the tool building helped the development of the brain. It's like the brain size which you can find in fossil skulls and so forth, that went up by a factor of 2 during this process. And there's this great quote from this Greek philosopher: it's because of his being armed with hands that man is the most intelligent animal. So, okay, then we have something like, now we are down to say 100,000 years ago, somewhere there, because we don't have a fossil record for language. We have the development of language, which is unique to humans. No apes have language. Now, why did language develop? This is sort of a cartoon figure which has various theories on language developed for gossip or for coordination among like hunter-gatherers working together, etc., etc. Okay, but this is speculation. So, so roughly speaking, here's the story. So we have the development of vision and locomotion like 550 million years ago. Manipulation refers to the hand, right? Language, and then successes in AI seem to follow the same order. So note that we have made the most advances in vision and locomotion. Manipulation, yes, I mean that's what robotics is about, and lots of work has been done in it. But I would argue that we are still a long way away from human capabilities in certain aspects, and a big limitation is the hand. Think of this hand, these hands. There is touch, there's sensing, there's tactile sensing, there are many degrees of freedom, there's force feedback, etc., etc. And compare this to the parallel simple 2-jaw gripper, which is what is common in many robotics tasks. Now, of course, robots can operate and lift much heavier weights, etc., etc., but that kind of flexibility and dexterity that the human hand offers, we don't quite have. Now, contrast this with vision. In vision, what do we need? We need a camera to replace the human eye or the retina. And these cameras now are very high resolution. So we are not held up by the sensing device. The sensing device that we have for artificial systems is as good as the human eye. The actuation device for robots is not as good as the human hand. It is very good for specific limited functions where you can, of course, have much greater power than humans, but it's not so versatile and general purpose. Locomotion, if you consider wheeled locomotion, then that's also basically a solved problem, right? For indoor robots, for cars, we don't have a problem there. If you want to talk about uneven ground, climbing stairs, then certainly there is a lot of research there, because that's where legged locomotion comes in handy. But if you are on flat ground or on a freeway, no problem, we know how to solve this. So vision and locomotion, both of them being sufficiently advanced, is why self-driving cars is so much of a big deal these days, because what does that need? It needs those two capabilities should be there, right? And those two capabilities are there. So okay, so that's the big context that I want to keep in mind. That said, the focus of this course will be on vision, but remember, vision is not in isolation, it's connected to all of these. We will, near the end of the course, focus a bit on the connection of vision to locomotion and the connection of vision to manipulation, because that's what justifies our work here. Okay, now I'll use this slide as a way to structure a lot of the material in this course, and I call these the 3 R's: recognition, reconstruction, and reorganization. These are different aspects of the vision problem. So what do we mean by recognition? So recognition is connecting to similar concepts that you have encountered before. So in that picture you will say that's a dinosaur, a pear, a crumpled paper. So typically it's about attaching labels to category labels to objects that we see, but it's in a way broader than that. Think of it really as connecting individual instances you see to examples which are similar to it that you have observed in the past or encountered in the past. So that's recognition. So classic example, face recognition, right? You see a picture and you say this is Bill Clinton. That's face recognition. It could be activity recognition. You have some video clip and you say in this video clip somebody is swimming. That also classifies. Reconstruction is about reconstructing the 3D world from which this 2D image arose. So you can think of it as the inverse of computer graphics. So in computer graphics, we make up a world or a scene, right? In that world we populate. In a video game, what happens? There's a world which is populated with objects and scenes and characters and so on and so forth. And this world exists in 3D, and what you can do is rendering. From that you produce the pixels, and the pixels are in a frame and you see that frame, and then 1/30th of a second later you see the next frame, and so forth. Well, when we talk about reconstruction in vision, it's the inverse problem. We start from the sequence of images and we want to say what was the world that gave rise to those images. And for those sequence, what that might mean is what's the depth, what's the distance of every point in the scene with respect to the viewer, what's the surface normal, what's the reflectance, what's the illumination. All those kinds of attributes which a graphics person needs to know in order to produce the pixels, we are now going in the opposite direction. We are starting from the pixels and we want to say something about the scene. So that's a problem we have. Reorganization, sometimes people call this grouping or segmentation, and it's really about the fact that the image, even though it appears to you like a set of pixels, 1,000 by 1,000 pixels or what have you, it's really not pixels, it's ultimately objects, right? The dinosaur, the pear, the paper. So going from this representation of 1,000 by 1,000 pixels to 3 objects. This is what psychologists call this perceptual organization. And sometimes people call it grouping. You're grouping a set of pixels together because they belong to one object. Or you can call it segmentation. You start from that entire image, which is one entity, and you break it up into these 3 entities. Either way, you can start from the full thing and talk about breaking it down, or start from the individual pixels and talk about putting them together. So I call this reorganization because I want everything to start with the letter R. And so my talks have this slogan, the 3 R's, because otherwise people would normally just say organization, but okay, you have to indulge me on this. And then the next point is that I've got these bidirectional arrows to indicate that these are 3 processes which play off each other. It's not that you first do reconstruction and then do recognition. I mean, we used to have models like that in computer vision back in the 80s and 90s, which was very simplified views that first you did something, one stage, and very pipeline kind of approaches. And this is not what works well, and this is not what we do these days. We really think of these as processes which are happening simultaneously and where information is flowing back and forth among them. Okay. So now I have that same figure, but it's now been made more schematic with some arrows and so forth. So each of these directions is each of these 6 edges. So if you have 3 nodes, you have 6 edges. Each of these is a valid direction for information flow. Okay, so now let's get real. So here's an image. Now what is it actually? Well, in fact, at every pixel, what you have are 3 numbers. The R, G and B values. That's what you have there. What do you see? Do you see that this is really like in the R channel 195 and in the G channel 198 and in the blue channel 23? Each pixel has those 3 numbers. That's what the stupid computer sees when you give it give it an image. But what do we see? What do we as humans see? We as humans see a very rich scene with people, and something is going on, this woman is walking away, this guy is looking at this person, etc., etc. Our goal in computer vision is to get to all of that. The same kinds of inferences that humans make, that's what we want to get the computer to make. What can we do today? So, and this is what you will study through this course. We have a lot of these capabilities now. I mean, we may not have it at 100% accuracy, but we are sort of close to being able to do inferences like that. So that person in green, so you see that it's all segmented out as one group. So that's the reorganization problem. So we have identified that as one entity. We have recognized that entity as a person. It's a person, not a giraffe. And then that person is performing some action which is walking away from us. So that implies some judgment of depth, that the depth with respect to us is increasing. And this person is carrying 3 bags, which requires doing further segmentation and recognition. Similarly, this person, okay, so here I've put a stick figure. So not only do we see this as a person, but we can say where the arms are, where the elbows are, where the shoulder is, where the head is, etc., etc. So that's what that stick figure indicates. And then we can look at that person's eyes, and we can infer the gaze direction and sort of think that he's looking at this woman. And this woman is a musician, obviously. There's an accordion, there's a bag. Now there's this bench, and then we can match this bench to like a 3D model of a bench, and then that model is being placed in the scene at a certain pose. There's a certain rotation of that CAD model that is needed to put that in the right place. So this is sort of basic bread and butter of vision, and that's what most of this course is going to be about. How do we get from pixels to these kinds of inferences about what's in the scene, where is it, how far away is it, and so forth. A little bit of history. So computer vision is now in its 6th decade, because traditionally we say it started in the 1960s. There was a PhD thesis from MIT in 1963, Larry Roberts, which is regarded as the first PhD thesis in computer vision. And at that time, I mean, remember I started with this discussion of computing power. So to think about the computing power in the 60s, you have to run Moore's law backwards. Normally people talk about Moore's law forwards, right? That every 5 years computing power goes up by a factor of 10. So now what you have to do is, okay, if you were 20 years ago, computing power was 10 to the 4 times smaller than today, and so forth. So imagine in this era. So at that time we have like relatively few people working on it, these brave, intrepid souls working on a problem which they have no hope of solving given the computing power of the day. But artificial intelligence, image processing, pattern recognition. In the 1970s you start to have the first work which is sort of doing the basic math of image formation. It's also, the development of computer vision is in parallel with the development of graphics. So Horn, Kudring, Longet-Higgins, these are, some of their research we'll have occasion to see. In the 1980s is when vision became its own field, separated out from general AI, and it essentially became applied mathematics. So we drew on many different kinds of mathematics, geometry, multi-scale analysis, probability, control theory, optimization, etc. So my own entry into computer vision is sort of in that era. But remember, computing power is still quite small compared to today. 1990s was the success of geometry. And why? Because we didn't need the fanciest computers for that, right? It was pencil and paper. It was working out the math. So the math for 3D reconstruction. How if you have some points and you have some points in the 3D world, you have their projections in multiple views. From those, how will you make inferences about the points in 3D? Right? That's a geometry problem. We worked out algorithms for doing that, and that could be done without that kind of computing horsepower. 2000s we start to have major advances in visual recognition, initially in very specialized domains like say face detection and face recognition, and then in the 2010s much more widely. Okay, and here in this era we have massive computing power, and we have lots and lots of training data. So these learning type approaches, which need tons of data and tons of computing, have come to the fore. Those approaches could not have been tried back in the 60s and 70s because we had neither the data nor the computing. So what you had to do was to try to sit down, think it through, try to formulate it sort of analytically. That's what we had to do. We had no choice. Okay, and now we do. And now we can, instead of thinking through the details of something, we can just say, okay, let's design this learning engine, give it suitable input and output, and internally the parameters will be adjusted so as to do the right thing. Okay, so let me pause here for any questions on this historical story, and then I'll kind of move through various phases of computer vision. Okay, so moving along, let me talk a little bit about the geometrical aspects of computer vision. So the geometrical aspects of computer vision are, how do we know something about the 3D world from multiple images? So the most obvious answer that people will give is stereopsis, right? We have two eyes, and there is this object out there, that pyramid, and we see a projection of that in the left eye, we see a projection of that in the right eye, and they are slightly different. And that slight difference is actually called disparity, and binocular disparity, because it's from two eyes. And that disparity is a signal to depth. If a point was at infinity, if it was infinitely far away, the image in the left eye and right eye would be the same, the disparity would be 0. And so this is a signal from which we can estimate depth. So this is the answer that everybody gives if you ask them, why do we see depth? Oh, because we have two eyes. But let me convince you that this is completely wrong. Okay, all of you have to do this. I'm taking off my glasses, you may or may not take them off. Now shut one eye. Okay, now have you stopped seeing depth? Am I closer to you, or is the table closer to you? Okay, okay. Hence it is nonsensical to assert that the only way we get depth is from these two images. Okay, depth, in fact, if you think a little bit, and we'll do that in the course, once you work out the math, disparity is in fact a signal which is only good near to you, because the accuracy of it falls off as 1 upon z squared. So as z is larger, the accuracy is very small. Okay, so stereo is really meant for helping you with manipulation and objects which are near you. Okay, very far away, the disparity is practically 0, and there is not much of a signal there. So what is the signal? And we'll come to that. Okay, so now what is binocular stereopsis? There is one camera and there is another camera, right? And these two cameras are in slightly different positions. Now imagine that you are a cheapskate and you don't want to buy two cameras. What should you do? You should take that one camera and move it, right? I mean, let's just use the hardware twice. Okay, so let's think about this more generally, which is that you just move the camera, and that should give you information somewhat similar to that for binocular stereopsis. Indeed, we can do that, and this is what we call optical flow. So optical flow it's like the continuous disparity signal corresponding to a moving camera. So as I move, objects in the world appear to move. Or it could be that I am stationary and the object in the world moves. Fine, it's all just relative motion. And this is the kind of perception you will have if you are a pilot trying to land a plane. You will see the ground sort of streaming away from you. And this apparent pattern of movement, we call this optical flow. Okay, each of these arrows shows that. So the semantics here is that there was a pixel at a certain in your previous frame, and in the next frame it is here. So the movement, apparent movement of that pixel is corresponding to some feature on the ground is what we call optical flow. So we have vectors like this at every location, and that is called the optical flow field. Okay. And then we can think about this very generally, that you have a left camera, right camera. Now we are getting more and more rigorous and formulating things mathematically. Between these two cameras there is some rotation and translation, and then the basic principle is actually quite simple, but it takes a little bit of technical stuff to work it out. If I see a point in one view, what do I know? I know that it lies somewhere along that line, right? The position of a pixel in a camera image tells me that the point in the world must lie somewhere along that line. And then there is a second camera, and there I see that point at a certain pixel. So that tells me that the point must lie on another line, sort of going out to infinity through the center of projection. And therefore it must lie on both those lines, and therefore it must lie at the intersection of those. So this is the so-called principle of triangulation. So it's really as simple as that. The physics of this is so super simple and intuitive. Okay, but there's some churning out to be done, because we do not, for example, know the rotation and translation between the cameras, and that has to be solved in between. Okay. So this is so I have now discussed the most basic way of estimating three-dimensional geometry or depth in the scene, which is to have two cameras or a moving camera, right, which are equivalent. But we can see depth even in a single image. So let's look at this image, and let me ask you the question. Here is an object, right, and there is an object. Okay, let me call this A, and let me call that B. Which is closer to you, A or B? Okay. Now you are totally wrong, because both of them are at about 5 meters from you, because they are on this flat screen, right? I mean, they're just like 5 meters away. I mean, and obviously that and that, A and B are both 5 meters away from you. Okay. So what happened here? So what happened here was that you were fooled, right? But you were fooled for a good reason. This is an illusion. This is what people call illusions. But illusions are in fact totally reasonable, because what did you do? You didn't recognize that I'm playing a little game, and this is really the projection on a sort of a screen. What you thought was, imagine that you were viewing this out in the world, and this was what was the image cast on your retina. In that case, what's going on here is there are certain inferences that you're making. You're making the inference that this pattern of tiles or this pattern of disks, that they are likely the same throughout, but they look different to you. If they look different to you, why is that? Because maybe they are further away from you. So the same disk, if it's of the same size and shape, but it is further away from you, then it's going to look smaller. So you make the inference not that the disk there is smaller, but that the disk is further away. If it's half the size, it is at twice the distance. That's the kind of assumption we make. And generally, except when I'm playing tricks like this for you, that assumption is going to do the right thing. It's going to more often lead you to make correct inferences about this geometry of the world. So we are able to in fact see depth and shape in a single image. And the reason why we are able to do this is because of our experience with the world, and that the world has certain regularities, that this pattern of tiles is not sort of changing arbitrarily in size, but very often it is homogeneous, etc. So therefore this is a matter of experience, and therefore this should be learnable. And we will see in this course various techniques which enable us to get to the problem of 3D inference from a single image, and it will be viewed as a learning problem. You can approach it analytically too, and in the earlier history of computer vision, we did approach it analytically. We tried to do the math for this is called shape from texture, and I have written papers on topics like that, and it gets quite hairy and complicated and so on. But there's a simple-minded way, which is that if you have lots and lots of training examples of images like this and what the depth they correspond to, we can train a neural network to learn this mapping. Okay, let's take another example. Okay, so here's an image on the left and here's an image on the right. Okay, so you see this pattern, and here is a little linear structure here. Okay, now I want to ask you the following. If I moved my finger on that, right, would it feel like a ridge or would it feel like a groove? Just imagine I'm moving my finger here. Is it going to be something raised or is it going to be like a groove? Raised, right? Okay. Now again, this is just a pattern of pixels with light and dark. I mean, you've made inferences which have led you to this. And by the way, and if I did the same thing here, what would you see? Grooves. In fact, the image on the left and the image on the right are exactly the same. They've just been rotated by 180 degrees. So you take exactly this image and you make it upside down. The left image made upside down is the right image. And that has totally changed your percept. Now why is that? So we can tell a story. So we can tell a story, and the story is something like this. So in the environment that we grow up in, which is that this earth, where does the light come from? The main source of light is the sun. The sun is above. So what's happening here is that there is a bright part which is above, and there's a dark part or like self-shadowed part which is below. And that is consistent with a hill, right? If the sun is above, then that would give rise to that. And here you have the opposite. If you have a groove, then the lit part is below and the dark part is above. So implicitly, when you guys made this inference about ridges versus grooves, you somewhere in your visual system was kind of compiled in the assumption that light comes from above. Now you can mess with this. So people have done these tricks where you raise chickens in an environment where the light comes from below and so forth. Because we have this question of, is it learning, is it but anyway, we'll talk about that when we get there. Okay, here's another picture. Okay, you have 4 spheres there. Okay, okay, so let's call this this sphere, let's call this sphere 1 and let's call that sphere 4. Okay, is 1 nearer to you than 4? Yes? Okay. Okay, now we have this picture. Here, what do you think? And by the way, the spheres are exactly the same. Okay, the only difference is in the shadows. I mean, just convince yourself. The spheres are exactly in the same arrangement. All that has been done is a manipulation of the shadows. The cast shadows, in this case, is sort of directly attached, and here it is below. And that little trick is enough for you to perceive in one case the spheres as being kind of in the same plane but at different heights, which is figure B, or further away, which is figure A. So small changes in the stimulus, in the small changes in the image, give rise to very different percepts. And these are all, and this is not something that you thought through and reasoned. You did not, did not like write down 17 facts and make inferences from that, right? It was not that you were running some kind of a complicated reasoning procedure as if you were doing a mathematical proof with various steps, right? It's all sort of compiled into your neural networks, in this case the real neural networks, not artificial neural networks. Okay, so I think what I tried to show in the last few slides are some examples which are really due to our colleagues in psychology, and they have been studying this phenomena of visual perception for hundreds of years, and there are many clever insights from them that we should draw on, and throughout the course you will find a sprinkling of that. And now I'll turn from the psychologists to sort of computer vision people and just show off some of the successes that we have. So on this problem of reconstructing the world, what can we do today? So we can do a lot, and here's an example of a paper which is from the mid 2000s, so say 2005, 2007, that kind of thing. So so this is an era where the internet was in full swing, and there were people, so all these random tourists go off to various places, take pictures and upload them on the web. I don't know why, but they do it. Okay, so now what do you do? So this is say Flickr. So now what you can do as a computer vision person is you can say, aha, these are all tagged with Colosseum of Rome. Let me download a bunch of these pictures, and tourist A takes it from here and tourist B takes it from a slightly different position. So we have information which is equivalent to that of stereopsis or structure for motion. And okay, we have to do a bit of work. Well, that's what Snavely, Seitz and Selinsky did, and the net result is that we can build these beautiful reconstructions. And there are reconstructions not just of buildings but whole cities. Okay, and we can do this in a variety of settings. So one is that you can have so this is relying on sort of crowdsourcing. Tons of people taking tons of pictures, but each camera is different and you don't know its parameters and so on. An alternative is that you have your one camera which you know, and you know its parameters, it's all the focal length, etc., and you move around in some environment and we build 3D models. And this can be done, and there are tons of papers on how to do reconstruction of these scenes. And this is of course very, very important for this whole business of AR and VR, augmented reality and virtual reality, because what does that rest on? You need to have real world captured into our computer, right? So it rests on techniques such as this. And so we just talked about like one of the R's, reconstruction, but you can imagine bringing in some semantics. So so when I have this, so let's consider reconstructing this room. You can do it as, okay, depth values for every pixel, but that's not enough. You really want to know that these pixels belong together, and that's a table. And why might one do that? If you are doing AR, augmented reality, and what you wanted to do was to interact with various people and by putting objects on this table. So it's a virtual object on a real table. Well, you really need to know the geometry of the real table, right? So that you can situate an object correctly. So that these fields, AR and VR, really rest on the ability of computer vision to deliver on 3D reconstruction and semantics and so on and so forth. We can do these reconstructions of environments, we can do these reconstructions of shapes. So there is a data set called ShapeNet from Stanford, and what they show is that we can we can do these reconstructions from single images once we have trained a system with various examples. And again, we are going to study this later in the course. Okay, I meant to give you a break, which I have zoomed on ahead, but let's do that. So let's take a 3-minute break right here.
Quick question. So I'm actually taking this class for like part of like the research I'm doing, but I don't really come from I took like a machine learning class a long time ago, but I don't come from a machine learning background.
Okay, excuse me. Hey, Alyosha.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Thank you. So should Should we tell people that if
Let's get started again. So maybe we'll start with dealing with some of the bureaucratic aspects. So first of all, I want to introduce Professor Alyosha Efros, who's just come, and Professor Stella Yu. Actually, so the lectures in the course are going to be by the three of us, and then the TA Pulkit Agarwal. Actually, come here, otherwise the camera can't see you. Yeah. So Pulkit is the TA, and you saw the other professors for the class. Okay, and I think
another TA who is stuck in China, but he should be back soon.
Okay, and I think Alyosha will say something about the enrollment policy. Maybe you should use the mic.
All right.
All right, folks. We are super oversubscribed, as you probably know. So there is actually two waiting lists right now. There is a graduate student waiting list, and then there is an undergraduate student unofficial waiting list that you get on by filling that form that we had you fill out last semester. So right now we only have 8 empty seats in the class, but we are working to try to get a few more seats because we are webcasting this lecture, so we should be able to get permission to get more seats so that some people who cannot fit in the room can watch the webcast. It will probably take a while. We probably will increase it by maybe 25 to 30 seats, okay? So we have 100 undergrads on the waiting list, so maybe 35 of them will get in, okay? And the group has been really strong. Pulkit has been working very hard to try to kind of prioritize it, but so you should have gotten an email from Pulkit to tell you if you are on the short long list or the long list. You can check with him, and so that will take us a little bit of time. Hopefully by next week we will sort all of this out. 189 or 289, the machine learning class, is a hard prerequisite for this class. So if you have not taken this class, or you have taken it and didn't get a good grade, you will not be able to take this class for credit. Now, of course, you're always welcome to watch the lectures on the website. Another point that I wanted to mention is that I see there's a bunch of people sitting, playing with their laptops, chatting on Messenger, or looking at cat pictures on Facebook. Pulkit will be checking out to see who are those people that can safely be dropped from the class, because they wouldn't even notice. But seriously, if you are here in class in the physical seat, please don't use your laptop. If you want to use your laptop, there is a webcast online. So go ahead and use the webcast and see it there, okay? Any questions on the logistics? So there is going to be a syllabus. We're going to have n number of assignments. We're going to have an exam. We're going to have a final project at the end of the semester, kind of a standard kind of graduate level class material. Any questions before we continue? Yep.
Yeah, just a quick question about the final project. My understanding is that it's like an open-ended sort of research paper project. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, and it will be done in groups, just because we can't handle watching 130 individual projects. So start figuring out who your buddies are. Okay. Okay. On with the show.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so let's restart. Right, so now I'm just going to dig in a bit more detail on each of these modules, or processes, shall we say, how recognition can help reconstruction. So these are just vignettes of what we will study in this class. For example, we have an image, and it's a single image, and we want to know depth and shape and so forth. So one way to do this is that you recognize that this is a car, so you can segment out the car. You estimate the pose of the car, at what viewpoint is it with respect to the camera. From that, because you have seen many cars before, you build a generic 3D reconstruction, kind of a cartoonish model of a car. And then you make it specific, because you actually have pixels corresponding to this car, and that's a full reconstruction. So we call this category specific object reconstruction, and we'll study techniques for this. Let me take a little bit of time to turn to the neuroscience of vision. I gave you a few examples of visual perception, so what the psychologists have told us about vision. Now let's turn to what the neuroscientists have told us about vision. So the hardware in the brain by which vision is accomplished. So there's a visual pathway. It starts from the two eyes, the retinas. There's this cable called the optic nerve, and then there is the part of the brain here called the visual cortex, and so forth. And there's research going back to the late 1950s and early 1960s from Hubel and Wiesel, who discovered properties of neurons in the visual cortex this area V1. V stands for vision and 1 for 1, which means it's the first area where visual processing takes place. And they found cells which responded to edges or bars at particular orientation. So if it was a 45-degree edge, the neuron liked it a lot, so there were spikes. If it was moved away, it needed right position, then it didn't spike. If it was at the wrong orientation, it didn't spike. And neuroscientists have really gone sort of quite a bit down in terms of understanding different parts of the brain. So this sort of looks more or less like the layout of a chip, but in fact it's not a chip. It is areas, each of these blocks, these rectangular blocks, corresponds to some real estate in the brain. I mean, the brain is like a two-dimensional sheet of processors. Roughly speaking, you can think of it as a handkerchief which you crumple up and shove it into the brain. That's what that's what the brain is. So these various areas have connections and so forth. So there is one particular pathway called the ventral stream, which has to do with recognition. So we start out in the occipital cortex, which is kind of at the back here. So this is sort of like, the picture is like this. This is the back this is the front of the head, and there is this one pathway which is where object recognition kind of stuff happens, and this other pathway which is more related to sort of geometry and action and things like that. So in this ventral stream, you have these areas like V1, V2, V4, and so forth, and so the information from the image, it sort of sequentially propagates through these areas. So it arrives in V1 40 to 60 milliseconds after the image is on the retina, and in V2 it's 50 to 70 milliseconds and so forth. So the stages in the processing in the brain, they are kind of slow, because across a synapse you always have some delay which is on the order of milliseconds. You contrast this with computer circuits which are much faster. And then the receptive fields are getting bigger, meaning that there's a bigger set of pixels of the image that they are processing. Okay, so inspired by these kinds of architectures which were discovered by Hubel and Wiesel back in the early 60s, and then was studied by many other scientists. Hubel and Wiesel themselves got a Nobel Prize in 1981 for their discoveries. This led people to propose neural networks. Now we're talking about artificial neural networks, architectures which were inspired by the feed-forward architecture of the human visual system. So here is this paper from Fukushima, 1980. Okay, and Fukushima designed this network which was just modeled after Hubel and Wiesel's findings in neuroscience. And what he said was that you have to have these alternate layers of simple cells and complex cells. So this is related to Hubel and Wiesel's findings. Simple cells will respond to some feature like an edge or a bar at a particular location. For a complex cell, you can perturb the location a bit and the cell still fires the same. So they have these alternating simple cells and complex cells. And then as you get, the earlier stages respond to things like, is the edge at 45 degrees or vertical or horizontal and so forth. And at later stages, the neurons might respond to something like, is this a face, or is this a dog, or what have you. So that's what the later stages are. And it's a purely feed-forward network. And another remark is that mechanism of pattern recognition unaffected by shift in position. So you want to recognize a dog whether it's in the left part of the image or the right part of the image. So therefore the neural network has to have the property that it's invariant to shift in position in the image. You want to recognize a face whether it's on at location 20, 60 or 75, 85. So therefore the pattern of weights is replicated across space, and this is what results in us calling it convolution, because convolution is kind of this basic mathematical operation. And so this is in the 80s, and then what happened later in the 80s was that Jan LeCun took this architecture which was a basic neural network architecture, and he figured out a good way of training it. Training it means estimating the weights of this network. And in the early 80s, backpropagation had been sort of invented, or in fact I think the right term is rediscovered. There is a long debate that you can get into as to when was it actually discovered. If you want to have fun on that topic, Google for a person called Jürgen Schmidhuber, and he has written a lot on this topic. Okay, so anyways, backpropagation became well known in the early 80s, and if you take backpropagation and you apply it to those architectures like the neocognitron, you put that all together, and Jan LeCun did that, and and he called this architecture LeNet, and he used it for digit recognition, and it was quite effective for digit recognition. And it also worked for some other tasks, but somehow it was never popular in the computer vision community, because on very standard computer vision tasks we did not see gains from using neural networks compared to other techniques. And I think it was perhaps due to the shortage of training data. So we had more mileage from designing appropriate features and so forth. Anyway, by the time we come to the 2010s, you have tons and tons of data, you have the computing power, specifically GPUs, you put it all together, you have the success of this paper by Krzyzewski, Sutskever, and Hinton, which showed that these techniques work better than some other machine learning techniques. And since that time, since this 2012, the computer vision community has sort of very broadly adopted these neural networks, or convolutional neural networks is a very common type, because we want to have invariance to position as kind of the basic workhorse through which we get stuff done. So okay, let's move right along. So let me talk a bit about how reorganizations, how these groups can be used for recognition. And I'll just give you a little flavor of it. Suppose we have an image like that. There is certain kind of grouping we can do even without knowing about specific object categories. For example, we could group together a set of pixels, like the pixels corresponding to this lady's t-shirt. They're all white, they have the same color. So we could imagine that that's one group, right? And this pattern on the field, the yellow flowers, you can imagine grouping them together just based on color. So that does not require experience of specific objects, right? But then to put it together as one person, you can't put together these set of pixels corresponding to one person without some experience with this category, because part of the pixels are white and other pixels are pink and other pixels are brown and black and what have you, but all of them belong together to one person. So this requires experience, it requires training, it requires lots of examples of what people look like, because people have multicolored patches on them. So I should tell you this term which we use a lot in computer vision, superpixels. So superpixels correspond to a group of pixels which have the same property, such as color and texture. And then so this idea, so we can generate these candidate regions, these sets of pixels, and then we can use that as a way to do object detection. Because what we can imagine is that we take an image, we extract candidate regions, then for each region we try to classify this as, is it a chair, is this a dog, and so on. And what the problem we are trying to solve is that in one image we have many objects. So if you took that whole image and you fed it once to a classifier, and a classifier is trying to find one object in there, right? But that's not true. We have multiple objects in that image. So what we need to do is to isolate a particular object. So you want to isolate the pixels of one object, and you do that by these region proposals, and then you feed those set of pixels to a classifier, and then it will say this is a dog, and for another set of pixels it will say it's a chair, and so forth. So this is work from 2014, actually, from Berkeley. Then there are variations of this theme. So RCNN stands for region. R is for region, CNN is for convolutional neural net. And then there was something called a fast RCNN, and then there's something called a faster RCNN, and we'll spend time on that in the course. And the net result is this is a paper from, I think, 2015, using something called a residual network, which showed amazing results. So here we have all these bounding boxes, which so every bounding box corresponds to an object. So you are localizing the object, and this object is a person. So person 0.998. So that's a estimated probability that it's a person. And there's a knife here, knife with probability 0.997, and so on. So this is what we can do today. And how it happened was, again, we'll see this in the course, but a big component was that training deeper and deeper networks and finding techniques for training deeper and deeper networks. Let me go in the opposite direction, which is if we can do recognition, how does that help with reorganization? So what did we do just now? We had these candidate regions, and then we said classify what is each of these regions. Now I want to go in the other way around. I want to do first recognition, and that helps me segment out the object. Are there scenarios for that? So let's look at this one. So okay, first question, how many of you have seen this image before? Okay, so those of you, you have to stay quiet, you can't speak. The rest of you, what do you see in this image? Okay, where is the dog? Where is the head of the dog? Is it on the right or the left? So this is like the head of the dog, and this is one leg, another leg, and so on. Now, if you just looked on it as a pattern of black and white, it would be pretty hard to group it together. You are doing it top down. You sort of have a model of what a dog looks like, and you are coercing that template of the dog to fit the data, right? So it's so there are sometimes when the segmentation happens top down. I mean, actually all the time it's like a mixture of bottom up and top down influences. And this is the current state of the art. It's something called mask RCNN, where what we can do is we don't just recognize an object, we also mark the pixels for it. So this is this group of people, and so notice that previously we just had a bounding box and we said dog, person, and here we actually mark the pixels for each of these. So this is what we can do, and there's some quite very, very impressive results that these systems are able to do. Okay, but isn't this very unsatisfying that all you have are flat patterns, right? But the world is not flat. I mean, the world consists of objects which have three-dimensional shape and which are arranged in some spatial layout. So we need to bring in geometry back. So right now, what I did was I had this geometrical thread talking about stereo, structure from motion, with the intended application area, AR and VR. And then I had this thread which was based on learning, and where the output is objects with labels or objects segmented out with their masks and so forth. But we want to kind of bring these two worlds together. And a good example might be that in this we should not just state the object, but we should say something about its shape and where it is located in the world. So I'll talk about that, but not for all objects, but in fact for humans. So imagine that we have some images of people, and what we will do is we will output what the shape of the person is this a thin person, a fat person, tall person, skinny person, etc. Then pose for people is about how their body parts are arranged, and the net result is that and then you have a mesh for the person, and this means that you can do graphics and you estimate where the camera is. So I'll just show you some results. So we're starting with an image video, and what we are producing are these meshes of this person over time. And so this is kind of the state of the art of what you can do today. And this is for humans. Humans are obviously a very challenging case. If you have rigid objects, that's a much easier problem. I'll show you some results which are at tackling the problem of action recognition. So here we have these various red boxes which correspond to people, and then there are labels which I don't know if you can read in the back, but this label is jumping, this one is phoning, this one is playing an instrument, reading, riding a bike. So classification can be not just of object categories like dog or cat. Classification can be of actions like jumping, phoning, playing instrument, reading, etc. And this can be done from video or from single images. Sometimes the action is so characteristic that a single image is enough. So these are examples from single images, like phoning. You see somebody with his or her hand like this and you pretty much can guess that they are phoning. But there will be tasks where this is not enough. So think of picking up an object, picking up versus putting down. If you see a single frame in that, you won't know which one, whether it is picking up or putting down, right? Because it's the same set of frames but just in the opposite order. A single frame will not be enough. But if you have the sequence, you can tell. So some more examples. We want to do more than just saying hitting. I would like to say that this person is hitting this ball with this bat, right? So this is what's called semantic role labeling, and in language this is all very well developed, right? So they have the agent, the patient, the instrument, etc., etc. So we want to, so in language understanding people want to identify the roles, and we want to do that from images. Now this actually connects up to language, which is that we want to describe what's happening in an image with a caption, or we want to answer questions about an image or a sequence of images, and that's an active topic of research. Where should we go next? So here is all the stuff we can do, and here is what we want to do. Okay, so currently the state of the art in computer vision is pretty good in inferring all this geometry stuff and so on, and we'll do all of that. But what I personally like is what's really the essence of this. This guy is looking at this woman. She's a musician, but there's a bag here which you can see. If you see, there are some dollar bills in there. So obviously she is playing, but she expects that people who listen to her music will put some money there. And this guy, I don't know what he's going to do. Maybe he will listen for a few minutes, put in some money. Maybe he's a cheapskate. Maybe he's trying to decide, I need to catch my train, etc., etc. So this is what I think we want to understand. So when we talk about visual understanding, vision connects to cognition. That's the whole story. We are doing the low-level building blocks, but visual understanding is the whole enchilada. That's where we need to be. And so here's a terminology you can use: social perception. So humans spend a lot of their time interpreting other humans, right? But computers have a very pitifully low social intelligence. We need to understand, so we want to understand the state of other people. We need to not just know about their pose and geometry. We need to know, are they happy, are they sad, what are they trying to achieve. If you see somebody is trying to pick up, like if you're at a dining table and you see somebody sort of reaching towards something, you know, okay, maybe what they need you to do is to pass the salt to them. That requires us to infer that that person wants to have the salt because from their actions. So this is what we need if we want to have sort of computers and humans sort of working together. And we can't do this yet because we do not have good computer vision techniques for understanding the hierarchical structure of human behavior: movement, goals, actions, events. So what are we after? So now I'm going to get a bit more philosophical. We want to build models of activities and behavior. Okay, and this is a definition of a model from which I'll let you read. So, for example, consider that the activity of going to a restaurant. When you go to a restaurant, there is a model that you have of what will happen. You will go, somebody will take you to a table, then some waiter will come, they will give you some menus, then later on they'll take your order, etc., etc. So you have a model for the various sequence of steps that will happen. And this is how you interpret everything, right? Actions, there's a slogan in Vision which is that parts assume their significance in the context of the whole. And the same is true for individual actions. Individual actions, if you just observe 2 seconds, the significance of that 2 seconds is in the context of the bigger activity. And for that we need to have models which need to be learned from data. And these are active topics of research for us. Another topic is, so now I'm going to talk about how we acquire the training data. So we right now have been doing a lot of stuff with learning, but the kind of learning we have been doing is supervised learning of a very boring variety. So there's this mother who goes to the zoo and then says, oh, that's a zebra. Okay, good, child gets that input. Now what we do in computer vision is we say, this is a zebra, this is a zebra, and we say this 10,000 times. Okay, 10,000 examples of zebra, and now the system can learn the concept of a zebra by doing back propagation from the xi yi pairs. This is pathetic, right? Normally, how many examples did you need to have for acquiring the concept of a zebra? Far fewer. And the reason why is because you were already a visual genius when you went to the zoo. And the reason why you were a visual genius is because you spent the first year of your life doing stuff like this, right? Which is playing, interacting with the environment. And what is this child getting when she is playing? She is getting a visual signal, she's getting a touch signal, so she's getting all the state of the motors of her hand and so forth, and then she's performing actions and then seeing the results of those actions. So she is acquiring knowledge of physics, it's acquiring knowledge of social behavior, etc., etc. So all of this is part of how children build up their models of the world. That child who has done these experiments, it's Alison Gopnik has a book called The Scientist in the Crib. That scientist in the crib is like a genius, and then she goes to the zoo and mom says, that's a zebra, done. Now you have an example of a zebra, and you can recognize zebras from different poses, etc., etc. If the zebra is running, why? Because you've seen dogs running, from which you can transfer to zebras running. So I think that this is where we want to go. We are at the top, but we want to be at the bottom. So this is a great new challenge. How do we get out? How we learn in a better way with less label data? And I want to tell you that this idea is, of course, not new. This idea goes back to the great Alan Turing, and in a paper he wrote in 1950. This is the famous paper where he proposed the Turing test. But so people always quote the paper, but they never read it. If they actually read it, in section 6 of the paper you have this quote, which is, instead of trying to produce a program to stimulate the adult mind, why not rather try to produce one which simulates the child's? If this were then subjected to an appropriate course of education, one could obtain the adult brain. Beautiful, right? So what we can do is we can make use of much less training data, hopefully, if we find the right sequence of instruction. And then you should not need label, you should essentially manage from self-supervision as the child is experimenting with this world, looking for sort of consistency among different channels of input, etc., etc. So this is what I actually believe in. I think that the stage is ripe for research in this paradigm. And this was Turing writing in 1950. Since then, I mean, generally there have been advances in science everywhere, but in particular people have done a lot of work in child development. So in child development, I mean, this is again a branch of psychology where people study babies and infants and how they acquire knowledge of the world. And I just picked one paper from that literature, which is the development of embodied cognition. And I'm going to conclude with this slide, which are some of the lessons which computer vision or robotics can get from understanding the course of human development, what babies of 0 or 1 year old or 2 years old do. So they are multimodal. So like that baby in the crib playing has access to visual signal, has access to sounds, has access to touch from the sensors on the hands, and its internal signal because it knows the parts of the human body and so forth. Incremental, you don't start teaching calculus to a 6-month-old baby, right? There's a sequence in which various things happen. And be physical. So they're actually interacting with the world. It's not just symbol manipulation. So explore, children are doing lots of experiments. Social, they acquire knowledge not just from themselves but from teachers and parents and caregivers, right? Why is humankind today in a different place than we were 100,000 years ago? I mean, the IQ of your 100,000-year-old ancestor in the savannas of Africa was probably the same as yours. The difference is that in the last 100,000 years, human culture and the development of science and technology is what means that you're sitting in chairs in Berkeley rather than running with a spear in the savannah. Okay? And of course we have language, which makes for sort of a certain symbolic aspect as well as communication. Thank you very much. Sign up for Piazza. Go to piazza.com and find CS280 and sign up. Most communication will be through that.